The first time I saw the Bluefin Diner, it was exactly the kind of place I expected to find in a wasteland like this. Route 66 stretched ahead like a ribbon of asphalt through the barren desert, the air shimmering with heat under the relentless afternoon sun. The road seemed endless, with nothing but barren land and the occasional cactus breaking the monotony. It was the kind of desolation that made you feel small, insignificant, just another speck in the vastness of the universe. I'd been on the move for weeks, drifting from town to town, with nothing but my old duffel bag and a sense of hollowness that had settled in my chest like a stone. After losing my job and falling out with the few friends I had, it felt like there was nothing left for me anywhere. The nights were the hardest sleepless hours spent staring at motel ceilings, wondering if I would ever find a place where I belonged. I had no family to turn to, and each new town was just another place to pass through, another attempt to escape the emptiness inside. I have no family, no friends, and no place to call home. The kind of person who could disappear without a trace, and no one would even notice. It was as if I was a ghost already, drifting aimlessly, waiting for anything to give me a reason to stay. When I pulled into the parking lot, there wasn't a soul in sight. Just a faded sign hanging by a single rusty chain that read, "Help Wanted," and an old gas pump out front that looked like it hadn't worked in decades. The diner itself looked like it had been forgotten by time, the paint peeling, the windows dusty and streaked. It was a relic of a bygone era, a place that seemed to exist out of sheer stubbornness. I paused for a moment, staring at the sign. Maybe this was what I needed. I had nowhere else to go, no direction, just a longing for a place to belong, even if just for a few nights. The thought of having something to do, even if it was just washing dishes or sweeping floors, was enough to make me consider it. I pushed the thought away, taking a deep breath, and made my way inside, the bell above the door chiming softly as I stepped inside. The dime interior was a mix of peeling wallpaper, cracked linoleum floors, and flickering neon lights that cast eerie shadows across the empty booths. The air was thick with the smell of grease and old coffee, a mix that clung to my senses, making my stomach turn slightly. A single man stood behind the counter, his face lined and weathered, with hollow eyes that seemed to look right through me. He was the owner, though he never bothered to tell me his name. I hesitated for a moment before making my way to a booth in the corner. I slid into the cracked vinyl seat, the material sticking to my skin as I settled in. The owner watched me, his expression unreadable, his hollow eyes following my every move as if sizing me up. After a moment, he shuffled over, a notepad in hand. "What'll it be?" he asked, his voice gruff, his tone making it clear he wasn't interested in small talk. I glanced at the faded menu lying on the table, the pages yellowed with age and stained with coffee rings. There wasn't much to choose from, and everything looked like it had been there since the place first opened. "Just a coffee, please," I replied, offering a small, tentative smile, though I doubted it would make any difference. He nodded, turning away without a word. I watched as he moved behind the counter, the sound of the coffee machine breaking the silence. It felt strange, almost surreal, sitting there in the empty diner, the hum of the old refrigerator the only other noise. The neon sign outside flickered, casting brief flashes of red and blue across the room, adding to the sense of unease that seemed to permeate the place. He returned a moment later, setting the chipped mug in front of me. I wrapped my hands around it, savoring the warmth, even if the coffee itself tasted burnt and bitter. It was something tangible, something to hold on to in the unsettling quiet of the diner. "Thanks," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He gave a curt nod, his eyes lingering on me for a moment longer before he turned away, his footsteps echoing across the empty floor as he retreated behind the counter. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still watching me, even when his back was turned. I cleared my throat, pointing towards the sign outside. "You hiring?" I asked, my voice sounding smaller than I intended, the words barely carrying across the empty room. He looked at me for a moment, his gaze weighing on me, then nodded slowly, as if the decision wasn't really his to make, as if he was resigned to whatever fate had brought me here. "Need a job?" he asked, his voice flat and devoid of any warmth, like he had heard the same request 100 times before and knew how it would end. I nodded. The truth was, I needed money enough to get me out of this place, to the next town, and maybe a little further. He didn't ask any questions, didn't want to know where I was from or what had brought me here. He just nodded back, a small, almost imperceptible movement of his head, like he understood more than he was letting on. "Okay, you'll start tonight," he muttered, his voice carrying a hint of something I couldn't quite place. Was it pity, or maybe just indifference? He hesitated for a moment, then gestured for me to follow him. "Let me show you around," he said, his voice still gruff but with a hint of resignation, as if he knew that neither of us had much of a choice in the matter. I got up from the booth, the seat creaking as I stood, and followed him through the diner. He moved slowly, pointing out the essentials with a practiced efficiency, his voice a monotonous drone as he spoke. "The counter where you'll be serving. Coffee machine temperamental, but it works if you treat it right. Kitchen's back here," he said, pushing open the swinging door to reveal a grimy room filled with old pots and pans. His words were clipped, like he was simply going through the motions. There was a wariness to him, an exhaustion that seemed to seep into every word he spoke. He showed me the storage room, the restrooms, and even the back exit, his explanations brief and to the point. There was no warmth in his words, no attempt to make me feel at ease. Just the basics, like he'd done this before, like he knew I wouldn't be here long. After a while, he turned back to the front, pausing by the door. "That's about it. Good luck, kid," he said, his hollow eyes meeting mine for a brief moment. There was something in his gaze, something unsaid, but before I could make sense of it, he grabbed his coat from behind the counter and walked out, the door closing with a jingle of the bell. I watched him disappear into the night, something about the way he'd said those words making my skin prickle. There was an emptiness in the diner now, a void that seemed to expand in his absence. But I ignored it. I needed this. I needed something to keep me grounded, even if it was just for a little while. I walked around the diner, taking in the peeling wallpaper, the cracked vinyl booths, and the flickering neon lights that cast an eerie glow over everything. There was something unsettling about the place, something that felt wrong, though I couldn't quite put my finger on it. Maybe it was just the isolation, the sense of being completely cut off from the rest of the world. I went to the kitchen in the back, a grimy little room filled with pots and pans that had seen better days. The air was thick with the scent of stale grease and something metallic, and I could hear the faint drip of water echoing from a leaking pipe. The floor creaked under my weight, and every surface seemed to carry a layer of grime that spoke of years of neglect. There was a window above the sink, looking out over the parking lot, and beyond that, a lake. It was the only thing that broke the monotony of the desert, a dark, still body of water that seemed to go on forever. I settled in behind the counter, a cup of lukewarm coffee in front of me as I tried to stay awake. The hours dragged on, the silence pressing in on me until I heard it, a soft, haunting melody drifting through the air. At first, I thought it might have been the wind, but as the sound grew clearer, I realized it wasn't natural. There was a rhythm to it, an eerie beauty that seemed almost deliberate. It tugged at something inside me, urging me to move, to follow. I frowned, looking around, but there was no one else in the diner. The sound seemed to be coming from outside, from the direction of the lake. I glanced out the window, catching a glimpse of the dark water. The lake lay still, its surface unnaturally smooth, reflecting the pale light of the moon. It looked almost lifeless, an expanse of inky black that seemed to swallow all light and sound. There was something about it that made my skin crawl, a sense of wrongness that I couldn't quite shake. I shook my head, trying to ignore it, but the melody grew louder, more insistent, until I found myself standing up, my feet moving almost as if they had a mind of their own. It was as if the sound was pulling me, dragging me towards the door, and I felt an overwhelming urge to step outside and find its source. I walked to the door, my hand reaching for the handle, when something caught my eye. A crumpled note, stuffed inside the lining of one of the cracked vinyl booth seats, the tear just big enough to hide it. The paper was creased, torn at the edges, and in scrawled handwriting it read, "Do not, under any circumstances, go near the lake. If you see wet footprints leading from the lake to the diner, clean them immediately with hot water. If you hear scratching on the windows, keep your eyes on your work. The diner lights must remain dim but never off. I looked back at the door, the melody still calling to me, but I forced myself to step back to sit down. I couldn't explain it, but something about the note felt true. The note was unsigned, but I felt a chill run down my spine as I read it. The old man hadn't mentioned any of this. As I looked at the stains, the smudges of dark red that could only be blood, I felt something twist inside me, a sense that this wasn't just some elaborate joke. As dawn broke, I saw the owner return, his hollow eyes glancing at me without a word. He looked more tired than before, his gaze lingering on me for a moment longer than seemed necessary. He didn't ask if I'd heard anything, didn't seem to care how my shift went. I watched him for a moment, wondering what secrets lay behind those tired eyes, before returning to my car to try and get some sleep. Exhaustion weighed heavy on me, but sleep was elusive. When I finally dozed off, I dreamed I was drowning in the nearby lake, the dark water wrapping around me, pulling me under while the haunting melody echoed all around, muffled and relentless. I jolted awake, my heart pounding, the fear lingering even as I tried to shake it off. It wasn't much, but it was all I had, a few hours of uneasy rest before the next night began. I found an old, half-stale sandwich that tasted like cardboard, and washed it down with a cup of coffee so bitter it almost made me gag. I forced it down anyway, needing the energy. The next night was different. I was wiping down the counter, the old man gone home for the night, leaving me alone in the dimly lit diner. The air was thick, the oppressive silence broken only by the faint buzz of the flickering neon sign outside. It was almost 1 a.m, and the road outside was empty. Nothing but darkness stretching into oblivion. The hum of the old refrigerator seemed to grow louder in the quiet, a low, unsettling drone that made the hairs on my neck stand on end. I could hear the occasional creak of the building settling, the soft rustle of something brushing against the outside walls, maybe the wind, or maybe something else. The air felt colder now, the chill creeping in, making me shiver. I decided to take a break from the unnerving quiet and clean the restrooms. I grabbed a rag and some cleaning supplies and made my way to the back. The restrooms were just as grimy as the rest of the diner, the tiles cracked and stained, the mirror above the sink coated in a layer of grime that made my reflection look ghostly. I scrubbed at the sink and wiped down the counters, trying to ignore the growing sense of unease that seemed to be pressing in on me. The sound of dripping water echoed off the walls, each drop seeming louder than the last. When I finally finished, I took a deep breath and made my way back to the front of the diner. But as soon as I stepped out of the restroom, my heart froze. There, on the floor, were wet footprints. I dropped the rag I was holding, the sound of it hitting the ground barely registering in my ears. The footprints led from the door, across the diner floor, and toward the counter where I stood. They were elongated, almost human but not quite, with webbed impressions that suggested something unnatural. My heart pounded as I backed away, my eyes tracing the eerie shape, each step seeming deliberate, as if whatever made them had been searching for me. I remembered the second rule: clean them immediately with hot water. My heart pounded in my chest as I rushed to the back, my footsteps echoing through the empty diner. I fumbled with the bucket, my hands trembling as I turned on the tap, the hot water rushing out and steaming up in the cold air of the kitchen. Every second felt like an eternity, the feeling of something closing in on me growing stronger. I could almost sense eyes watching, waiting. I filled the bucket to the brim, the hot water scalding my hands as I picked it up, my grip shaky. As I hurried back to the front, my nerves got the best of me. I stumbled, the bucket slipping from my grip, hot water sloshing over the sides and splashing across the floor. Panic surged through me, my breath catching in my throat as I scrambled to pick it up. The scalding water burned my hands, but I barely felt the pain. My only focus was on those wet footprints. They were growing darker, spreading across the floor like an ink stain, each print more defined, more deliberate. It was as if whatever had made them was gaining strength, its presence becoming more real, more solid. I grabbed the rag, my hands trembling as I dipped it into the bucket and began scrubbing at the prints. The hot water steamed as it hit the floor, the vapor rising around me like a fog. I swore I heard something, a hiss, low and menacing, like the sound of steam escaping from a valve. It was followed by a whisper, faint but unmistakable, as if something was speaking to me, taunting me. I scrubbed harder, my breath coming in ragged gasps, the fear clawing at my insides. The footprints slowly began to fade, the dark impressions dissolving under the hot water, but the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. My eyes darted to the windows, half expecting to see something staring back at me, but there was nothing, only darkness and my own reflection, pale and terrified. For a brief moment, I thought I saw movement in the reflection, a flicker of something shifting behind me. I spun around, my heart in my throat, but there was nothing there, only the empty diner, silent and still. I forced myself to breathe, to calm down, but the fear lingered, gnawing at me, refusing to let go. It was as if the darkness itself was alive, pressing in on me, waiting for me to slip up, to make a mistake. By the time I was done, the diner felt colder, the air heavy and oppressive, the silence almost deafening. I set the bucket down, my hands aching from the burns, and took a step back, staring at the floor. The footprints were gone, but the sense of unease remained, an invisible weight pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe. Something wrong was going on here, and I knew this wasn't the last time I would see something like this. I glanced at the windows, half expecting to see something staring back at me, but there was nothing, just darkness and my own reflection, pale and frightened. For a brief moment, I thought I saw movement in the reflection, a flicker of something shifting behind me, but when I turned, there was nothing there. I forced myself to breathe, to calm down, but the fear lingered, gnawing at me. When the owner came in to begin his shift, I told him about the strange things that had been happening, the footprints, the whispers, the movement in the reflection. He listened with an expression that seemed almost indifferent, his eyes tired and hollow. When I finished, he let out a long sigh and shook his head. "You're just tired," he said dismissively, his voice flat. "Working nights can mess with your mind. You start imagining things, seeing things that aren't there." He gave me a half-hearted smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Get some rest, you'll feel better." His response left me feeling uneasy, like he knew more than he was letting on. There was something in the way he spoke, the way he avoided my gaze, that made my skin crawl. But I nodded, forcing a smile, pretending to believe him. Deep down, I knew what I had experienced wasn't just in my head. Something was wrong with this place, and he knew it. I told him that I was only staying for this night and expected to get paid tomorrow morning so I could leave. He gave me a strange look, then smirked, his eyes cold. "Sure, kid," he said, his voice dripping with something I couldn't quite place. "Tonight will be your last night." I tried to rest during the day, catching whatever sleep I could. It wasn't much, if someone could even call it sleep, but it was just enough to get me through the final night. The following night brought a darker, heavier atmosphere to the diner. Shadows pooled in every corner, stretching long across the floors, as if something unseen was lurking within them. I held my breath, the silence thick, waiting for the familiar yet dreadful sounds that had haunted my nights here. Suddenly, the jukebox crackled to life without warning, spilling out a warped, haunting melody that didn't belong in this world. The song was unrecognizable. Distorted echoed off the walls, grating against my mind like nails on a chalkboard. I rushed toward it, fingers fumbling over the buttons, desperate to shut it off. But the buttons wouldn't respond, as if they were locked in place. No matter what I did, the music only grew louder, more chaotic, each dissonant note stabbing through my head, making it impossible to think. It was as if the jukebox itself was alive, feeding off my fear. Then I heard it. It started soft, almost like a gentle brush against the glass, but I knew better. I knew it meant that something was out there, something dangerous, something that had found me and wasn't going to leave until it got what it wanted. The scraping grew louder, more insistent, and with each drag of a nail against the window pane, I could feel the weight of something waiting. Rule 3 echoed in my mind. If you hear scratching on the windows, keep your eyes on your work. Swallowing hard, I forced myself to stare at the counter, at the dishes I was drying, moving my hands in a mindless rhythm to keep myself grounded. My pulse thundered in my ears, but I kept my gaze fixed, my fingers clutching the plates tightly as though they were my lifeline. The scratching continued, scraping deeper into the glass with each pass, filling the silence with a maddening rhythm. The jukebox went quiet just as abruptly as it had started, and the scratching stopped. The diner fell silent, but I knew the danger hadn't passed. I let out a slow, shaky breath, my heart still racing. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A figure stood by the window, tall and gaunt, with matted hair falling over a face that was half hidden in shadow, except for its eyes. Those eyes gleamed through the glass, piercing like they could see straight through me. Its lips curved into a cruel smile, revealing teeth jagged and sharp, too sharp, as if they were meant to tear through something soft and fragile. My hands trembled as I clutched the counter, fighting the urge to look, to meet those eyes. But I could feel it calling me, its voice slithering into my mind like a twisted lullaby, a hum that carried with it the weight of everything I'd tried to escape. The creature knew me. It whispered my name, my secrets, my regrets, each word laced with venom, each syllable pulling me closer to the breaking point. Just as I felt myself slipping, the door burst open, slamming against the wall with a force that snapped me back to reality. The old man stood there, his eyes wild, his face twisted in terror. He looked at me, and in that moment, I saw more fear in him than I had ever seen in anyone. His voice trembled as he spoke. "Sorry, kid," he whispered, his words thick with guilt. "You weren't supposed to make it this far." Before I could react, he strode toward the window, his hands shaking as he reached for the latch. My heart sank, fear twisting in my gut as I realized what was happening. He was letting it inside. 1,000 thoughts raced through my mind. Why was he doing this, and what would happen if he succeeded? The sense of betrayal and desperation made my pulse quicken, and I felt utterly powerless, my feet glued to the floor as the horror unfolded in front of me. As the old man's trembling fingers fumbled with the latch, the creature's grin widened, its sharp teeth glinting as though it could already taste what was to come. I took a step back, dread coiling in my gut, every fiber of my being screaming at me to run. But I couldn't move, my legs frozen in place as the man turned back to me, his face hollow and filled with a strange mix of desperation and surrender. "I didn't want this," he murmured, his voice barely a whisper, as if trying to convince himself more than me. But I had no choice. It keeps her satisfied, and it keeps me safe. He swallowed, his voice dropping to a ragged whisper. But it's never enough. The horror of his words crashed over me. I was just one more in a long line of sacrifices, lured here to save his miserable life. The disgust was overwhelming, but there was no time to think. Behind him, the creature's fingers curled over the window frame, long and dripping with a dark, murky substance that trailed down the glass like ink. A rush of panic surged through me. I had to stop him to prevent whatever horror was clawing its way into the diner. Desperate, I charged at the old man, my body colliding with his as I tried to stop him from opening the window. He grunted, his eyes flashing with a wild fury as he shoved me back. "You don't understand," he shouted, his voice cracking, filled with both fear and anger. He lunged at me, his hands outstretched, trying to pin me down for the creature that was now moving steadily towards us. We struggled, our bodies crashing into tables and chairs, the metal legs scraping loudly against the floor. His hands wrapped around my wrists, his strength surprising for someone who looked so frail. I could feel his nails digging into my skin, his breath hot and ragged against my face. My heart thundered in my chest as I glanced over his shoulder. The creature was inside now, its twisted form moving with a sickening fluidity, its pale skin glistening, its mouth stretched wide, revealing rows of razor-sharp teeth. With a surge of adrenaline, I twisted my body, managing to free one hand. My fingers scrambled across the counter until they closed around something cold and metallic, a kitchen knife. Without thinking, I plunged it into the old man's side. He let out a choked gasp, his grip loosening as his eyes widened in shock and pain. I pushed him away from me, his body stumbling backward, directly towards the creature. The creature's eyes gleamed with a predatory hunger as it reached out, its long, wet fingers wrapping around the old man's shoulders. He barely had time to scream before the creature sank its teeth into his neck, the sharp fangs tearing through flesh with a sickening crunch. His body went rigid, his eyes wide with terror as the creature dragged him down, its teeth still embedded in his neck. I could see the blood trailing behind them, dark and slick, leaving a gruesome path as it pulled him closer to the open window. His screams echoed through the diner, a desperate, haunting sound that sent shivers down my spine. His eyes locked onto mine one last time, filled with a pleading, terrified look, but there was nothing I could do. He was beyond saving. They reached the window, and with a final jerking motion, the creature dragged him into the shadows outside. The old man's screams were cut off abruptly, leaving only the sound of the creature's rasping breath and the faint crunch of his body being pulled over the gravel outside. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. My heart hammered as I listened to the horrible wet sounds fading into the distance. Without looking back, I turned and ran, my footsteps pounding against the linoleum as I burst through the front door and into the cool night air. Outside, the world was still and silent, a stark contrast to the chaos I had left behind. The cold air bit into my skin, grounding me as I staggered forward, trying to shake the horrifying images from my mind. I kept walking, my steps unsteady, my heart still pounding. I started the car and floored it. I had survived, but I knew I would never be the same. Her whispers would always be there, a reminder of what I had faced, of the darkness that lurked just beyond the surface of the lake.